Like today, like I said, I'm going to talk mostly about the peak period of the Pax Romana, which really, I guess, mostly occurs from the Julio-Claudian period, which we kind of already talked about. And I'll kind of get into like the Flavian period, which is kind of famous because they built the Colosseum at that time. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll get to the so-called Nerva-Antonine dynasties that, of course, reigned up to about 180, because 180 is when the Pax Romana ends. So we'll kind of talk about that. And I should have time to kind of go into and talk about the so-called third century of the Roman Empire, which was really the worst period of the Roman Empire when it really started to decline, starts breaking up and all that, which it will later. I'm kind of like, I think we're up to talking about the Flavian dynasty. That's about where we were, because I think we had talked about the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and I kind of went into the rise of Christianity as well. Kind of talked about that in the first century, but we'll go into, and I'll talk about the so-called Flavians that come in, which they only had three emperors that really reigned over it in the late first century. What happened to Nero, by the way? Nero, because of his fact that he was a kind of a tyrant and people thought he was unpopular and all that, his armies all revolted against him throughout his entire empire. And what happened was all of his generals, the soldiers, started declaring them emperor, basically. So it sparked a civil war between about 68 to 69 CE. And at one point, what happened to Nero, he was declared outlaw by the Senate. And so Nero was eventually forced to commit suicide, which he killed himself in 68. And then what happened was they had this period that came in that was called the Year of the Four Emperors, where these four Roman generals fought to control the empire. You can see Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then the most famous one was Vespasian. They would all fight to kind of control it. And what would happen is the last one there, you see Vespasian, he would conquer the empire and basically take over it. And he would start a new dynasty afterwards, which was called the Flavian dynasty, which I'm, of course, going to get to, of course, today. Hey, Jillian, looks like you're joining us, of course, today as well. So I hope you're having a great morning, of course, out there overall. But so yeah, you got the Flavian dynasty that comes in. The Flavians are in power for what is basically less than 30 years. So 69 to about 96 is the years. And the founder, you can see there, was a man named Flavius Vespasian. He was a Roman general. He's an interesting figure, by the way, Vespasian. I think I've got some images of him I can kind of share with you right here. Here, of course, is an image of him on the left with his two sons on the right, which, of course, were Titus and Domitian. Vespasian actually came from kind of a middle-class background somewhat. I think he was the son of a tax collector, rose up through the military. He was actually a pretty successful general under Emperor Nero. The dynasty is composed of, you can see there, his other two sons, which were, by the way, Titus, Domitian, which reigned, by the way, Titus reigned, you can see, for about 2 years or so, 79 to 81. And in the longest reigning was Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96. So both of those were like basically brothers of each other. And what's interesting about Titus and Domitian is that they were the first Roman emperors to succeed their father. This had, of course, never happened before. Maybe they got adopted or whatever, but this is kind of a rare thing in Roman history, where you've got somebody succeed their father. It doesn't happen very often, It happens with, I think, Marcus Aurelius, with Commodus, you've heard of that. And I think Septimius Severus had two sons, Caracalla and Geta, that did the same thing as well. So it's kind of a rare thing where, the sons would do that. Most cases, the emperors are chosen by the military or sometimes even by the Senate. That's how they would become emperor. So that's kind of rare way that was. A little bit about Vespasian. Vespasian became famous for fighting in this so-called Jewish-Roman war, the first of like three of them that were fought in Israel. I don't know if you know much about the Romans, the Jews. They hated each other. They couldn't stand each other. It's kind of ironic that Rome became Christian later, because Jesus was a Jew. And anyway, what happened was in Judea, in what is Galilee, the Jews revolted because they wanted to have like a separate state and not be ruled under Roman rule. And so the Romans sent armies in there and crushed it. And Vespasian was one of the generals that was involved in the war, at least in the early part of the war, from about 66 to about 69, until he seized power. Oh, and then his son, who is in the middle of that picture right there. I'll get to Titus later. Titus was also involved in the war too. He was another general that fought in the war. And Titus is known for, if you know about this, sacking Jerusalem in the year 70. Helped kind of in the war. And that's kind of famous. If you know about the sacking of Jerusalem, they destroyed the second temple. If you know about this, and talked about how that kind of played kind of a role later in leading to why Christianity became the way it was later. Because basically Christianity becomes this Roman religion that's really non-Jewish that you've got. And it led to like the dispersal of all the Jews. Like all of them were they couldn't live there, at least not much anymore. And so they were forced out. And a lot of them like fled to different parts of the Roman Empire. They later call that the Great Diaspora, when the Jews were dispersed all over Europe and so on, etc. One thing about Vespasian that most people don't know about, he's the one that built the Colosseum. At least he started building it anyway in Rome. They think sometime after this war kind of started coming to an end in Israel. So he constructed it mostly, they think, with Jewish slaves. Maybe close to about 60,000 were actually brought in to actually build it. And, the Roman Colosseum is considered one of the most famous amphitheaters that was ever built by, of course, the Romans. If you know much about the Colosseum, it's basically a prototype stadium, like you see later, like football, soccer stadiums in the modern world. And it's the base of where that comes from, of course. Obviously, it was influenced from some Greek architecture and Roman architecture as well. And it was supposedly built on the site of where Nero had his golden house, like part of it, like his palace that was there. It was built on an artificial lake. And they called it Colosseum, by the way, because there was a nearby statue of Nero called the Colossal Nero. So people call it Colosseum. However, its real name was actually called the Amphitheater in Flavian, which you can see there. And it was actually opened in about the year 81, which Titus, Emperor Titus, the son of Vespasian, was the one that actually opened it and completed it. So it was actually built by two emperors, Vespasian and Titus. And you can see that's the maximum capacity seating in it. It's about 50 to 60,000. And if you look at the inside of the Colosseum, it's interesting about the seating that's in it. A lot of the seating, dictated kind of what the whole, social class strata was in Roman society. So obviously a lot of the lower seats, were basically where a lot of the upper classes sit. And as you went upwards, like upper class to middle class to lower class, at the top. It's kind of the way it was. Kind of like today when you buy tickets, to a football game or whatever, the nosebleed seats are cheaper, right? So that's kind of like the same thing back then. And you know much about, the entertainment like that, which was like mass entertainment, for the populace. A lot of people called it bread and circuses because of the fact that it was kind of used as a form of appeasement to appease the population. It's kind of, I feel like sports today is kind of that way too, to try to appease the population, and all of that. And the kind of mass entertainment we're talking about was all kinds of things. It's not just gladiatorial events, which, it's famous for, where gladiators go in there and fight each other, but you can see anything from wild beast hunts were actually done. Like in the mornings, they would sometimes have men that would come in and they would hunt wild animals from different parts of the empire that they would, I guess, capture or whatever, and act plays. They would put on plays. Sometimes they'd have plays and where somebody would die, they would die. Of course, they would reenact battles, historical events. Of course, gladiatorial events were also, of course, real popular. The most popular thing, really, of course, in the Roman world. It wasn't always to the death, like people think, and of course, these mock battles they had. Mock naval battles. There's this theory that they would actually flood the Colosseum with water, from an aqueduct, and actually have naval battles that they would have. And that was also a case where they execute people like Christians, POWs of war that they captured or whatever. They would sometimes execute, or actually there was cases where sometimes they would capture POWs and they'd force them to fight to the death. And then, like, one guy's left, was like, oh, we'll just spare him afterwards, or something like that. That whole thing where they have a thumbs up or thumbs down, when they're going to kill somebody at the end, they're not sure if that was something that really happened or not. I think in art it kind of appears later, like in Renaissance times, but they don't know if that actually happened. If they did that or not. They may have. But the Colosseum was around to like the 6th century, and they seem to think that maybe anywhere from 500 to 600,000 people may have actually died in the Colosseum. So you can imagine there's a lot of ghosts that are probably around that area where it is. The Romans, I don't have a picture of the Romans did have what they call the Circus Maximus that was nearby as well. It's a famous Roman racetrack that they used for chariot racing. I think other events they would put on, maybe they enact plays and other things they might do as well, and for entertainment as well. But it had a huge capacity of like something like 250,000 that could sit there, watch, chariot racing, because chariot racing or horse racing was very popular in the Roman world, like it was in the Greek world. And the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire had something similar at Constantinople, where Istanbul is today, which is the so-called hippodrome. There's a smaller version of it that maybe seated about maybe 1/4 amount of fans that could watch it. So that's kind of talking about, some of the things that were, famous under Vespasian and part of Titus's reign that got going. But most people don't know who actually built the Colosseum. They think it was built earlier or something like that, but it wasn't really built until the later part of the 1st century. All right, so let me also talk about this other emperor, of course, who was Titus, Emperor Titus. Titus, who you see in the middle there, was a very popular emperor. He didn't reign very long. I think he was in power like something like 26 months was about it. They think he died of some kind of illness. He was more famous as a general, defeating the Jews in the first Roman-Jewish war. And I guess during his reign, he's popular for 2 reasons. One, he completed the Colosseum, and he opened it and had the first public games that they put on the Roman world. And then he also was the one that built the Arch of Titus, by the way. That's also there in Rome, which I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it was also built by Jewish slaves as well. And but the thing that he's more famous for, which of course I'll talk about today, of course, is the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that occurred, kind of at the beginning of his reign, that they have happened in the year 79. And I don't know if you ever heard much about Mount Vesuvius. It's a famous volcano that's in Italy that has erupted multiple times. And the last time it erupted, believe it or not, was during World War II, when the Allies were fighting the Axis powers, most of the Germans, in Italy. And they say that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 was 100,000 more times powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, just to give you an idea of how powerful it was, basically. And it went on to destroy several Roman towns, like on the west coast of Italy, where Naples is today, which those 2 cities right there, Pompeii, Herculaneum, were actually buried with volcanic ash and debris. And the amount of people that were killed in it varied. I think it's different numbers on that depending on the sources, but I think as many as maybe 15 to 20,000 may have died, but they couldn't find much because most of the bodies were burned to ash. I don't know about like they had, lava or anything like that, but they knew like a lot of, volcanic ash buried it. And was actually an eyewitness who was named Pliny the Younger. He's a famous Roman author. He was a lawyer at the time. He and his uncle got caught up in it, in the actual volcanic eruption as they tried to evacuate. He actually wrote 2 letters to the Roman historian Tacitus. So that's why we kind of know about, the eruption. I think it's considered the first actual, uh, eyewitness accounts that are ever done about a volcanic eruption that's ever happened. So it's interesting about that. And I think Titus was kind of popular because he helped some of the people evacuate, but he left a lot of people, homeless because of it. But you saw how, the city was buried, which is something it's kind of known for, which is interesting about the ash. The ash helped to kind of preserve a lot of the city. Here's some of the ruins of Pompeii that you're looking at. And you can see, by the way, the volcano in the background. You see the top, it's all blown off right there. The city was notorious for its sex trade. They have these like brothels that they had that people would go visit, which I think at one point had been banned by Augustus. Like before that, like I think Augustus was kind of a prude. He didn't like all the sexual stuff, and like a lot of the actual brothels, they have some of the really explicit paintings showing like the prostitutes and the different positions that they would do with their clients and so on. But yeah, the city is famous for like preserving it, being buried with ash. And then I guess the most famous thing it's of course known for was all the bodies that they found, of course, at the site as well. So they actually found I think they took plaster of Paris and they actually were able to figure out some of the bodies and how they died. And I think there was even some cases, I want to say at Herculaneum, they found skeletal remains of Roman citizens. Because, the Romans back in those days were known for cremation. They didn't really bury their dead like we do now. Let me also talk for a few minutes, not much, but I'll kind of get into and mention a little bit about the other brother, which was Domitian. He was tyrannical compared to the other 2 rulers. I think that, but basically Vespasian and Titus are pretty popular. But Domitian was a tyrant, and he reigned from, you can see, 81 to 96. He was kind of infamous for his tyranny, but they say he was a pretty good administrator. Apparently, under Titus, it was a bad fire that took place in the year 80. And so he began kind of rebuilding Rome. He actually built numerous new buildings in Rome, kind of rebuilt it. Because, I think they had 2 fires in that first century, the one in 64, they had the one in 80. And anyway, what he was known for, which is kind of famous, he was known for like cracking down on a lot of the senators. He kind of weakened the Roman Senate under him, because over time, the Roman Senate and the empire is going to become more like a rubber stamp, with the emperor having more authoritarian power. He also persecuted a lot of people that were non-pagan, like Christian or Jews were persecuted. I think it's about that time they start taxing all the Jews. It's pretty much around that time, which is kind of famous. And also he cracked down on a lot of literature. That's part of why you can't find a lot of early Christian writings, because apparently Domitian had a lot of it destroyed. And so a lot of the original sources of the New Testament, like the Gospels or whatever, you can't find it because they kind of burned them or whatever. So I think later accounts are kind of almost like second or third accounts, of what they were before. But I suppose there's different sources on what happened to Domitian. There's theories on it, but they think he was assassinated in some kind of conspiracy that involved the Roman Senate with the Praetorian Guard. And so he was actually murdered in September of 96 CE. And that basically ended the whole Flavian dynasty. So that ended pretty quickly. But the Flavians were pretty important. They helped to kind of stabilize the empire and, continue the Pax Romana. And that's what we'll talk about today, how the Pax Romana is going to keep going. And we're going to have this new period that kind of comes into Roman history, which, of course, is the so-called Five Good Emperors period, the period of the Five Good Emperors, which a lot of historians seem to think that that's kind of the peak period of the Pax Romana, when the Roman Empire reached its maximum size, which was close to about 2 million square miles or so, which was in the year 117. The term period of the Five Good Emperors, which you can see there, is a name that was later adopted by this, you may have heard of Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince in the early 1500s in Italy. He was a diplomat, writer, and historian, and Machiavelli realized that during that period, like in the first century, around the first century, that in the Roman world, they had these cases where you had five good emperors in a row. And so they call them five good emperors or good emperors. I think it's also called as well. And so the term started being popular, and later historians, I think like Edward Gibbon in the modern times, started using the term as well. And so it kind of took off. But traditionally, the actual official name that they call this period is usually a period which is ruled by these two dynasties that are actually called the Nerva and Antonine dynasties. They call it like together like that, but it's actually two dynasties, one called Nerva and one called Antonine, that are kind of back to back. And they rule from about 96 to about really 192, the dynasty. But the good emperors go up to about 180 is when it is CE or AD, either one, of course, is fine. These are the emperors that are part of it. You have the Nerva one first, which you see is three emperors: Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian. So those three. The Antonine dynasty is Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, Lucius Verus, and Commodus. However, if you look at those on the bottom there, only Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius are considered the five emperors that are part of that. So Nerva through Marcus Aurelius, that is your so-called five good emperors. And here, by the way, I put it on the screen for you, but there they are right there. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. So we're going to talk a little bit about those emperors, of course, today, which those emperors really are your peak emperors that you have, during this period. And a lot of these emperors, worked hand in hand with the Senate. They're very popular with the people. A lot of these emperors also, you're looking at right there, are considered really to be some of the greatest emperors probably in Roman history. They could probably, a lot of those, like in that list right there, just showed you, at least I would say Trajan, Hadrian, and probably Marcus Aurelius, and maybe even Antoninus Pius might be in the top 10 emperors, by the way, that they had, in Roman history period. All right, let me first talk about, of course, I guess some of the first ones they had, which right there, you had the so-called Nerva, Marcus Nerva, or Marcus Cosius Nerva, I think is his full name that he went by. He didn't reign long. Nerva only reigned about 15 months as ruler. He was the founder of the so-called Nerva dynasty, and of course, he would actually pick his successor, which would be the Emperor Trajan, who was a Roman general. And he had Hadrian that would follow later. So those are kind of included as part of a dynasty that reigned up to about, I think it's like we have the year exactly, but I believe it reigned up to 138 is the year. And Nerva was a Roman senator who had been picked, pretty much handpicked by the Roman Senate to replace Domitian after he was killed. You can see there he was actually an advisor to Domitian. And he's not really known for much. He only reigned 15 months, believe it or not. He died of natural cause of a stroke in 98. But he is known for something that was kind of interesting. He started adopting basically his successor to replace him. He would adopt the best candidate, I guess, to be emperor. He would become his son. And then that became a traditional thing that a lot of emperors would do later, not just in this period, but later in the Roman Empire. And so a lot of the so-called good emperors, a lot of them became known as the so-called adoptive emperors, which at least 5 of them, I think, were adopted in that period. So yeah, he's not well known. Like most people don't know much about who Nerva was. Some people think he was a pretty good general, a pretty good emperor, but he's just like didn't reign very long overall. Now they had also Marcus Trajan. A lot of people call him Trajan for short. And Trajan was more of a famous general before this, who went back to the time of Domitian as a general. And he was famous for his conquests. You can see he originated from Spain. He's like one of the first emperors that came from Spain, which the Romans called Hispania in those days. He was even given an official title by the Roman Senate that was Optimus Maximus, Optimus Princeps, you can see, which is best ruler. And so it's under his reign, by the way, that the Roman Empire would peak in size, which I think 117 to the death of Trajan. That's about when the empire peaks at probably about 2 million square miles or so, roughly. And you can see it stretches from Spain all the way to Iraq at one point, into part of North Africa, and it also included maybe part of Western Germany or something like that, and then part of what is Britain also as well. So mostly England and part of Scotland. Right there. So it's a huge empire that you see. And you can see, I think they even kind of controlled at one point, maybe part of the Black Sea region for a short time overall. So yeah, he was the most ambitious Roman ruler, I would say, since Julius Caesar, like especially with conquests. But most of his conquests seem to be centered, if you really study about Trajan, they seem to be more centered in the East, more of course, in the West, which I guess is more solidified, the borders and all that. And these are all the different areas that he conquered at one point, they think. Armenia, which Armenia is kind of like in an area that's part of Turkey and part of Iraq. Now, I think also part of where Georgia is. I think if you go to this map right here, you can see it's about right here, that spot right here, where it would be. Roughly, Mesopotamia. They think he pushed the actual border of the empire to the Tigris River, east of the Euphrates. Crimean Peninsula. Yeah, they think they've actually found Roman ruins in that area around where the Crimea is. It's that peninsula that kind of sticks out into the northern part of the Black Sea, which is like right here. So they think they may have conquered that area at one point. So that's about as far east as they got in Eastern Europe, you can see. Romania, yeah, they took Romania, which Romania was called by the Romans. They called it, it's about right here, not here. They called it Dacia, D-A-C-I-A, and that they would control that area. And it's kind of where the term Roman kind of comes from also as well. The term Roman Empire, Romania is kind of term they use for that area. And then, of course, Jordan. You see Jordan also as well. Jordan was another thing, of course. That area about right here, that red area was one of the last areas that he also took over as well. They think he was also going to conquer, like the area of Saudi Arabia's, which would be kind of the east of Jordan and all that. He was thinking about conquering that next and adding that to the empire, but he died before he could do that. So it's a pretty ambitious ruler, Trajan. Trajan's also known for his building projects. I'll kind of show you that real quick here. But he did have these building projects. He had like the Forum of Trajan, or Trajan's Forum, is very famous. He built in Rome. He constructed that. So a lot of these, Roman rulers would kind of give back to the people, and it included like a market area that was there. There's also the baths of Trajan, Trajan's baths that he built there for the people. It's located in the Forum. And he had this column he built there, the so-called Trajan's column you see there in the picture, which is about 100 feet tall, was actually a victory column that he constructed when he conquered like Romania, where Dacia was, with the old name they called it. And it has a statue of him on top of it. And I think it has a staircase where you can go up to the top of it, or it used to be able to go up to the top of it. I don't think you can anymore, but you can walk up to the top and look out over the city. So yeah, he's known for his building projects and all that, and so on. But a lot of these emperors would do that, pretty much. All right, I'm also going to talk about also another emperor who was famous as well, who was Emperor Hadrian. That comes in, which you can see right there. And Hadrian was pretty famous as well. I'd say he's considered one of the top 10 emperors of all time. You could put him in that list. And he succeeded, of course, Trajan. He was adopted by him. He was also a Roman general that they think originated from what is Spain as well. I think he married one of Trajan's daughters, kind of intermarried to his family. He adopted him afterwards. And he's considered the last of the so-called Nerva emperors. They only had 3 of them, remember. And Hadrian is very famous as being a patron of the arts. He was big into Greek and Roman culture. He actually studied as an architect, believe it or not. And people called him, for some reason, the Greekling. So he had this, patronage that he would, patronize artists. He built a lot of famous buildings, like in Rome. He built fortifications. And a lot of these were actually designed by him, like from blueprints, And so, like I said, he was an amateur architect, believe it or not. And Hadrian is famous for building what they call Hadrian's Wall, which you can see here in that picture. And Hadrian's Wall was a fortification that was built by the Romans to protect the northern border of Roman Britain, which was mostly based in England today. And it was mostly constructed to keep out Scottish barbarians, such as those 2 groups you see there, the Picts and the Caledonians, which lived in the north. They were kind of similar to the Celts. And anyway, it was built by the Roman army, which is very interesting about that. Because, like, if you know about, I think I've told you this before, most of the things that were built, construction-wise, throughout the Roman Empire were pretty much built by slave labor. They hardly had any cases where, they would, build something with something else, like just private people or whatever, or citizens or whatever. And the wall itself varies on the height. I think there's kind of debate about how tall the wall originally was. They think it was maybe 15 to 20 feet tall originally. And then maybe the width of the wall was like 8 to 9 feet wide, to give you an idea of it. I've got other pictures showing like some of the parts of the height of the wall that are still there. Parts that have been stripped, over time. But they do include like what they call a mile castle. They would build these little fortifications around it, like watchtowers, kind of like what the Great Wall of China had. It's almost like the smaller version of the Great Wall of China, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And they have to construct these mile castles, which would house soldiers there. And the Hadrian's Wall, by the way, was in the middle of nowhere. It was like the most northern part of the border. I remember watching a movie one time. They said it was the asshole of the world. You didn't really want to be there, basically. And so, it's like that last part of the empire, I think that fell, I know, when the Roman Empire collapsed later. But anyway, but it was like the most northern border, pretty much, that they had. Way up there, compared to like where the rest of the empire was, in that part of the world. Oh, they did have another wall, which was built later. Oh, and by the way, the wall itself, I'll give you this. It's about 80 Roman miles in length, which a Roman mile is a little longer than our mile today, but 73 modern miles will be about the actual length of the wall itself, which went from the North Sea to the Irish Sea, like crossed it pretty much. And you can see when it was built, it was constructed about in the I think it's the 140s, no, actually 120s, excuse me. So when it was built, 120s. And then they had another wall that was built later by his successor that would come in, who was named Antoninus Pius. He built what they call the Antonine Wall, which was built near the Firth of Forth, in like close to southern Scotland, and it was about around close to 40 miles. You can see in length that fortification, but it was built in the 140s. But they actually abandoned it later. Like think around, like want to say near the end of Antoninus Pius's reign, and so Hadrian's Wall, like I said, became like the the so-called northern border of the empire, at least till like when the fall of the Roman Empire occurs, close to like sometime after 400. Hadrian also was known for this other building project, which is very famous, which you may have heard about, which is of course called the so-called Pantheon Temple, which was built in Rome. And this temple itself was actually a temple that was actually rebuilt from a previous temple, by the way, that had been built by Augustus like a long time ago. In fact, Marcus Agrippa, who I mentioned before, was one of the men that helped build it. And anyway, what happened was it was actually designed and constructed by Hadrian himself. I told you Hadrian was an amateur architect. And so he incorporated these ideas that included like Greco and Roman architecture. So a combination of Greek architecture, which went into like the front of the building. You can see like with the columns. It's got Corinthian columns on it though. You can see it has like a dome type building, which is part of it, which they think the dome was a type of architectural thing that was constructed by the Romans or created by the Romans a long time ago. And it is famous for its large sized dome, which is about, I want to say 142 feet wide, maybe is what it is about. And they called it Pantheon because of the fact that it honored like all the gods, all the Greco and Roman gods that existed. It is famous for having what they call an oculus, which is an opening, which is at the top where water would kind of come through, I guess. But actually, I guess let light in during the day and all of that. I think later the Catholic Church used it as like a church, like Christian church. And I think now it's more of a museum now. That people walk through and look at it, which I think 6 million people visited a year. At least that was before the pandemic, I know. So it's considered one of the best, buildings in Rome that's in shape. It goes back that far, like almost 2,000 years old from that time. So so that's basically some of the things that Hadrian was kind of known for overall. I'll get next, and I'll talk about also like some of the successors that come in next. Of course, you've got this other emperor that comes in next, which is Antoninus Pius, who you can see right here, who built the Antonine Wall above Hadrian's Wall. And Antoninus Pius is considered to be like the peak emperor of this period of the Pax Romana. He, of course, is the one that founded the so-called Antonine dynasty I told you, which had 4 emperors in it. Himself, Marcus Aurelius, who's like a nephew of his, Lucius Verus, who he also adopted, and then also Commodus. Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius. So they think he's basically considered where the empire itself prospers the most overall. It's considered, by the way, very peaceful. I think the only thing that really happened that was going on was he conquered part of like southern Scotland, where up to the Antonine Wall is, which was pretty successful. But they later abandoned it. And you're probably wondering why they called him Pius. Well, Pius spelled either P-I-U-S or P-I-U-S, I guess either one, or P-I-O-S, spelled all kinds of ways. But he's called that because he was very religious, but he had this thing where he wanted to somehow get his adopted father, Hadrian, deified as a god, which a lot of times they would do. A lot of the emperors were deified, and so he was kind of obsessed with it overall. And then the other thing he would do too that was also famous, he also adopted 2 sons to succeed him, not 1, but 2, which were Marcus Aurelius, which I think was a nephew of his by marriage. I think it was somehow related to one of his wives. And then Lucius Verus was also another boy that he also adopted too. who basically became what was the adopted brother of Marcus Aurelius. Those two were kind of considered brothers of each other, basically. And they would co-rule as well together from at least from 160 to 169, that they would kind of reign as emperors. So you don't have that either happen much either, where you have co-ruling emperors. That's also kind of rare too in the Roman world. Now let me move on to talk about also Marcus Aurelius, of course, the last of the so-called five good emperors that you have. Of course, there he is. Yeah. Marcus Aurelius is considered to be one of the greatest Roman emperors of all time. I don't know if he's the greatest, but he's considered probably the top 5 or top 10 emperors of all time. Out of the 5 good emperors, he's probably one of the best they kind of talk about usually. He did co-rule with his adopted brother, Lucius Verus, for 8 years. There's not really much on him, Lucius Verus. He's not as famous as some of the other emperors of that period, but he was a decent general under the Romans militarily. Aurelius, by the way, is a famous leader. He's kind of like a scholar kind of guy. He's kind of like, I think they sometimes called him the philosopher. You know about this because he was known as a Stoic philosopher, and he was famous for writing these series of books. I guess like 12 of them. I think they're kind of together in a manuscript later. There was like a tome, or kind of like almost like a diary of his personal thoughts, which became known later by the nickname the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or simply called usually Meditations. And they weren't supposed to be published. You know about this. I think he mostly wrote it to kind of better his life. And they were written on campaign when he was fighting in Germany. Meditations is based on the philosophy from ancient Greece, from the philosopher Zeno of Citium. It actually was the books itself, like 12 books, I guess it's really divided into, were eventually written in Greek, but they weren't discovered, by the way, until medieval times. I want to say late medieval, I believe it is. And they were discovered in the Vatican. They actually have found 2 manuscripts that were there. And in the 1500s, they eventually kind of took them and they kind of combined them and they formed it into this so-called Meditations of Marcus Aurelius that, of course, now exists overall. So a lot of people read it and get a lot of information from it. And so he kind of, I think Stoicism was kind of declining, but I think it was kind of a neo-Stoicism period that kind of comes in, but it later fades because of Christianity. Marcus Aurelius, kind of get into some of the things that happened, of course, under his reign. He was known for a lot of wars because one of the things that starts happening under his reign is the Pax Romana starts to come to an end. You start getting all these wars breaking out on their borders, mostly on the eastern border and northern border. There were 2 series of wars that broke out, by the way. They have the Roman-Parthian Wars, which were fought against the Parthian Empire, which was based in like the east, like around Syria, Iraq, and part of Iran. And then you had also the Marco-Mannic Wars, which were fought in Germany, which the Romans called it Germania. So both those were a series of wars where it kind of seems like, the Pax Romana is about to break. They had the so-called Roman-Parthian Wars, which had been going on since the 50s BC. You can go all the way back to Marcus Crassus when he got killed, Battle of Carrhae. It involved Lucius Verus, who was actually a pretty good general under Marcus Aurelius, who they co-ruled together, and he fought mostly in Syria and Iraq. And what happened was the Romans invaded into Iraq because they had lost it. I think by then they lost territory to the Parthians. And they sacked the capital of the Parthians, which the actual city I'll give you was a city called, I think it's pronounced Ctesiphon, is how they say it. Ctesiphon. And Ctesiphon, by the way, is kind of where Baghdad is now. I think it might be like right south of it, I believe. It's kind of a location where Baghdad will be built later. And so the Romans would actually retake part of that area, like Mesopotamia, I think part of Armenia right there. And kind of like, it was kind of like later a kind of a draw between them, I know later, but the Parthians kind of become still kind of an irritant to the Romans up until, I want to say, the 3rd century, believe it or not. Then they had the other conflict they had too, which was the so-called Marco-Mannic Wars, which were a series of wars where the Romans fought the Germans. That were kind of like to the north of the Danube River basin. And they were trying to push into the Roman Empire. I'll get to it later, but you have other people starting to push into Germany, like into Europe, such as the Huns, who were kind of seen as more barbaric. And so a lot of these people tried to flee them. That's why a lot of the Germanic peoples eventually attacked the Roman Empire, because they're trying to escape that. But also they wanted to come into the empire because of the fact that the Roman Empire was just more successful. So that's the reason for it. And the Romans mostly fought in an area that's now called Pannonia, which was a province that was part of the Roman Empire that would be kind of in those multiple areas, part of Hungary, Austria, and I think now what is called, used to be Yugoslavia, now Serbia and Bosnia. It's where the Huns would live, the Huns, which would come in later and kind of settle there, Attila the Hun and all that. But that conflict was interesting because they think it prevented these Germanic barbarians from invading at that point. But you'll see later that it's going to basically be just a trickle now. But as you get up to like the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, they get invaded, especially the Western Empire. And the Marco-Mannic Wars are like the beginning of the so-called migration period. I'll kind of get into that later, where all these Germanic peoples and other barbarian peoples start kind of taking over Europe, like the Huns, the Avars, and other groups, and Germanic peoples like the Franks come in, the Goths. I heard of them too, as well. And a lot of people call them the so-called barbarian invasions, or the invasion of the barbarians is what they really dub it in. But we won't get to that probably until next week and talk about that. But supposedly Marcus Aurelius stopped that, but later emperors weren't going to be able to stop it overall. Now, Marcus Aurelius, he would die in 180. They think he actually died of a natural cause, some kind of illnesses, because if you read like the Meditations, they talk about these plagues that start breaking out throughout the empire, which they think it was a bubonic plague, was one of the causes of why the Roman Empire declined, believe it or not. But he's the last of the Antonines come in, which is the Emperor Commodus. He comes in next. Commodus. And Commodus was this emperor who was kind of seen as this kind of a retrograde type ruler that was like some of these ones they had before. Nero, Caligula, etc. And he would reign from 180 to 192. And it's seen as the end of the Pax Romana. That's one of the things that's very famous about the period of Commodus, and the fact that they think he's the one that's contributed to why the empire starts to kind of fall apart after that. And Cassius Dio, who I think I mentioned before, who was a famous Roman historian, summed it up best, where he said that basically that the Roman state, like when Commodus came in, his reign basically marked the descent from the kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. Because you'll see later as they go into the 3rd century, the empire starts really falling apart at that point. And Commodus' reign was marked by tyranny, madness. There's kind of been a debate about whether he was a megalomaniac or something like that, but they do think he was insane, or possibly insane, Commodus. And you can see that one thing that he's known for, by the way, Commodus, he was famous for fighting as a gladiator in the Roman Colosseum. And the guy thought he was a god, or at least part Hercules or something like that. I think he would dress up like Hercules or something like that. That was his idol. And anyway, he would go into the Colosseum and he would either participate in wild beast hunts, like kill wild animals, or he would also fight other gladiators, which I think a lot of the matches were fixed. And I think it was a case where he actually would fight midgets or something like that and beat them up. Kind of weird. But it's kind of scandalous. A lot of the upper classes thought he was crazy. Maybe he was. But the lower classes thought he was great. Because, this guy going in there, it would be like President Trump. Like, remember, Trump was like big into wrestling and boxing. You'd be like him going in there wrestling or something like that. And that's kind of like the idea of what Commodus was. But Commodus was, they think, I think that what kind of caused his decline was in 190, they had another fire that broke out. And it got to the point where he wanted to rebuild the city. And he actually tried, this is how much of a, personality cult they had with him, was that he actually tried to rename Rome Commodiana. He was going to name it after himself. I think people didn't like that. And so he was later assassinated. He was killed in 192. And they think his death sparked another civil war that lasted from 192 to 193. They actually have a period in 193 called the Year of the Five Emperors, where they have 5 emperors that actually take control of the empire, which I think were mostly either Roman generals or Roman senators. And so you kind of see everything kind of starts coming undone at that point. And so eventually one of the generals seizes power, whose name is Septimius Severus. He kind of comes to power and will rule till 211. And Severus is the Roman ruler that will eventually kind of stabilize things. He creates a new dynasty, which is known as the Severan dynasty, which reigns from about 193 to 235. You can see it is the 5th imperial dynasty the Romans had. And he's an interesting figure, Septimius Severus. He was a general that was evidently who originated from North Africa. He was actually, I think, of some kind of Phoenician descent, they think. And he was from a city called Leptis Magnus, which is like a Roman city that was on the Libyan coast, on the Mediterranean Sea. Whether he's like African, like black, they're not sure about that, like his origins, but they think it's maybe like a mix of like Roman and probably Phoenician or something like that is what they think. And he was famous for his wife. That's well known. Julia-Domna was his famous consort, empress consort, and she supposedly had a lot of power behind the throne, believe it or not. But it's a very militaristic dynasty. I think they say that the reign of Severus is really considered to be the peak of the Roman military, like it's at its best, for the empire kind of starts going downhill after that. Julia-Domna, by the way, and Septimius Severus had these 2 sons. They were twins. They were named Caracalla and Geta, who actually co-ruled for a few years together. And they actually co-ruled with their father, briefly before he died in 211. However, the problem was that they didn't like each other. If you know about this, Caracalla hated Geta because Geta was, I think, more popular and he may have been better looking or something like that. And so Caracalla later murdered Geta in 211 and kind of co-ruled for a few years by himself. But his real name was Antoninus or something like that. And he got the name Caracalla because he kept wearing this Roman cloak around himself, which was called a Caracalla. So the name kind of stuck, apparently. Caracalla was, by the way, known for a few things. Here's a picture of Caracalla on the left right there. He's the one that issued the so-called Edict of Caracalla, which I think came out in 212 CE. And what the Edict of Caracalla did was it gave Roman citizenship to anyone that was free throughout the empire, which I think before it had been just like around Italy, I think. I know going back to the time of, I think Claudius, they start doing this to certain people, but I think only to certain people, I guess, the upper class. But basically anybody, I guess, that was a citizen could get then basically. And I think a lot of that would do with taxes, trying to get people to pay taxes in general, and also things like that as well. Also, Caracalla was known for the baths of Caracalla. I don't know if you heard about that as well, which the baths of Caracalla were considered some of the last baths that were built in Rome, which were built, they think, around the year 216 CE, roughly. So he was known for that also as well. By the way, the Severans were kind of bloodthirsty. That was a bloodthirsty dynasty. Of the 6 emperors that they had, 5 were assassinated or murdered. Yeah, it's crazy about that. Back here's all the other ones. I don't know if you have to know much about them, but they're not as important. But Macrinus, by the way, was some kind of Praetorian prefect that assassinated Caracalla and took power for about a year or so. Then you had Elagabalus, was a cousin of Severans. He ruled for about 4 years. He was actually a teenager when he came to power. Severus Alexander was another one. He was a teenager that came to power too. I think at the age of 13. He was also a cousin too of Severans as well. So majority of them were somehow related back to Septimius Severus, except for Macrinus, who was not. So they're all murdered at one point, and they think that Severus Alexander's death, 235, who was one of their longest reigning rulers, would actually mark an epoch period in Roman history, which became known as the crisis period of the 3rd century, which I'll talk a few minutes about before I go today. And this was a period in Roman history where the Roman Empire almost collapsed and almost fell apart. It's the worst period in Roman history, that they have. It's pretty much the Pax Romana is coming to an end. It's marked by civil wars. They get invaded by different peoples like barbarians. The monetary system becomes worthless. Like a lot of the coins, like the denarius, is what they call the Roman coinage system, starts to become worthless. It's kind of debased a lot. And it's a period of anarchy politically behind the throne and all of that. And a lot of the actual emperors, I think they called them nicknames during this period. They were called either, I'll put it up here for the screen here, but they were called either barracks emperors or they were called soldier emperors. And they had something like around 30 emperors in 50 years that actually reigned. And you'd have a case where an emperor would seize power and he would just get knocked off by another guy that was a rival. And so it was just constant civil war. And they couldn't decide, who the ruler should be. They didn't really have a good succession system, to decide who the emperor would be. And then on top of that, what also happened too was the empire broke up. It broke up into like 3 parts at one point, which were, I'll put on the screen, they had basically the Gallic Empire, which included like Britannia, which is Britain, Gaul, which is France, and then part of Western Germany was also in it. The Roman Empire in that kind of pinkish color. And then you had what they call the Palmyrene Empire, which was basically part of Syria, Egypt, and part of Turkey. So all those areas, basically, that's the areas that they broke up this empire during this period, which remained broken up, by the way, to like the 270s, roughly. And so not just political anarchy, but you've got, the empire kind of breaking up, and trade's also kind of starting to break up too, also within the empire, which is kind of a problem. Now, they did have this emperor that did come in later named Aurelian. That's well known. And Aurelian was an emperor, by the way, that would actually reunite the empire. He gets all the parts of the empire back together. I think in the year 274 is the year. And so the Senate gave him the nickname Restorer of the World. And so he's actually considered one of the best emperors in Roman history, even though he reigned only like 4 or 5 years. I think sometimes they put him in the top 10 too, believe it or not. But Aurelian was an interesting emperor. He did several things that's well known. He built the so-called Aurelian walls, which are fortifications in Rome, like some of the last ones that were built. He constructed that to protect the city. And he also was very famous for popularizing a new title, which was the title Dominus, which I'll get more to later, which means master. And so he was trying to give the idea that the emperors were more like lords over the people rather than just being like a first citizen kind of thing that Augustus had wanted. And you'll start to see later by 284 they have a new period that comes in with the Roman Empire, which is called the Dominate period, which goes from about 284 to 476. And Emperor Diocletian will start using it officially, and they'll get rid of the title Princeps. They won't use it anymore. So that's kind of the period of what we're talking about with the Roman Empire. And I will get more into it later, but the empire is eventually going to be broken up. It's going to be divided into the Western and Eastern Roman empires. I'm going to get into like the reforms of Diocletian that we have later. He's a famous Roman emperor that's going to rule in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. He's going to divide the empire up into these two separate states, which it will mostly have later. And you can see how basically the part on the left, will be the Western Roman Empire. You can see on the right, you have the Eastern Roman Empire, which is also later called Byzantine Empire. Those two states will eventually break apart, and they'll never get back together. And the Western Empire is going to collapse later. It's going to be taken over by barbarians, and then the Eastern part will continue as the Byzantine Empire, of course, later. So that's what I'm going to get into and talk about next week. We'll get into like I said, the collapse of the Roman Empire, and then I'll kind of talk about the Middle Ages that's coming up, of course, as well. So that's it for the week. So if anybody, like I said, has any comments, questions about the live stream, let me know later. Looks like we don't have any questions today, but you can send me any kind of comments, questions you want about this lecture, or also any other previous lecture, of course, I've had up overall. So before I go, don't forget that I did have some assignments, of course, later due in the week. Don't forget the two things, of course, are the book report in the 3rd vocab. And I did put up that new quiz number 6 on early Roman history. I think it goes up to like Julius Caesar's time or something in Octavian. But that's not due later until the end of the month. So that's it for today. Y'all take care. Now, I hope you'll have a good weekend coming up, by the way. I'll see you, of course, next week. So see you later.